So let's enter a world where illusion masks a terrifying reality. That magic is real, and death is nothing but smoke and mirrors. As we journey into Clive Barker's Lord of Illusions. New York private investigator Harry D'Amour recently went through a harrowing experience in saving a young boy's life during a frightening exorcism. However, he attempts to get back on track by following a routine insurance fraud case in Los Angeles, but quickly gets ensnared into strange dealings, stumbling upon a bloody scene and bizarre cohorts in the deadly Butterfield and the Rabbit Miller. With the incident hitting the news, D'Amour is soon approached by Valentin, the trusted aide of the world's most famous illusionist, Philip SWANN. However, it's SWANN's wife Dorothea who enlists the PI's aid to try to discover who might be out to kill her husband. When invited to SWANN's grandiose stage show that night, something seemingly goes horribly wrong as SWANN is impaled by his own trick and dies on stage. Yet the plot thickens as even Butterfield seeks answers as to who killed the famed illusionist. Harry's inquisitive mind is drawn into this mystery, seeking answers in the shadiest corners of the magic world, and deeper and darker secrets are illuminated as the truth that SWANN was no purveyor of smoke and mirrors, but that he possessed real magic. He learned this years ago from a fanatical cult leader named Nyx, whom he ultimately turned against and sent to the grave by young Dorothea's gunshot and SWANN's own magical binding. However, the power Nyx wielded was far more frightening than anything SWANN has dared to tap into, and the looming threat of his return from the grave is very real. Now with Butterfield cutting in close towards the secrets held by SWANN, D'Amour has to confront this dark power from the other side, and SWANN must face the terror that he hoped never to face again, in order to save Dorothea before Nyx's power swallows the entire world whole. So Clive Barker's Lord of Illusions hit U.S. cinemas on August 25th of 1995 and sprinkled out to a couple of few documented international release dates through late 1995 and into mid-96. And this was actually the third feature film directorial effort from Clive Barker after Hellraiser and Nightbreed, and sadly would actually be his last one because he did encounter a lot of production problems going into this thing in terms of the studio, looking at a test screening of the film and wanted to cut down about 12 minutes out of the film, which Barker was glad to do because they did kind of prove that he would end up getting the director's cut later on home video, which they did follow through on, but a lot of the stuff kind of ended up with the film not performing very well at the box office, garnering only $13.3 million off of $11 million budget. And so it didn't do much for Clive Barker in terms of getting a good career, getting a big hit on his record, or kind of endearing him very much to the studio system going through as a third-time director here. And so he decided he would just never direct another film again himself. And Lord of Illusions was adapted from a short story that he published in the Books of Blood Volume 6 in 1985 called The Last Illusion, which is a much more different type of story in a certain way, where it kind of focuses much more on kind of like the section of the film that involves kind of looking over the corpse of Philip SWANN and having a lot of different characterizations in a certain way, where Philip SWANN is much more of a guy who's from Europe, he's from Hamburg, Germany, and a much different type of confident character, and much different types of things go on throughout the course of the short story there. And the entire process of adapting this into a feature film started at Polygram Filmed Entertainment, which would produce Candyman before this is another Clive Barker adaptation, but kind of went out of business in the process of doing this, had to sell it off to MGM, who adopted in their brand newly relaunched United Artists label. And Clive Barker was so much intent with this film to meld the detective noir with the straight out horror stuff, and he does a really, really good job of it, I think, with his cinematographer Ron Schmidt, who hasn't had a lot of standout credits to his name. He's done a mix of TV and feature films and low budget stuff here and there. But I think they do nail something very good in this whole film. They get a certain sense of the noir in this whole thing, which creates a certain atmosphere in the film. It creates a certain thing that highlights the intrigue, the mystery that you're building up in the entire film. That like it pulls you in. What Harry D'Amour here is encountering. It starts to turn the wheels and get that certain aura in the whole film after you get that great opening in the film where you got everything out in the middle of the dried out California desert. Everything's kind of macabre and creepy and stuff like that. So you get a different sense of it up front. The kind of horror introduces itself, but then you kind of shift over into the detective noir stuff, and it starts to blend as the film goes on here and there, and it creates a nice atmosphere in the film where cinematography might not be super splashy or get a lot of heavy noir type of stuff in terms of like Dutch angles or certain kind of German expressionistic type of things or very interesting sort of lenses used in a certain way, but they do nail a certain style here that does feel very much in their line for that genre and still melds in the horror into the entire thing that feels very organic in a certain way. I think there is a very good sense of pulling those different things together that certainly been done before and stuff like, you could say, Angel Heart with Robert De Niro and Mickey Rourke, and maybe a little bit of Exorcist 3, getting the detective story mixed in with the horror stuff here and there, and certainly at the time the X-Files was probably doing a little bit of that here and there, melding in kind of the monster horror stuff with the noir type of settings and stuff like that as you go along. So there's a certain sense that kind of feels very nice in this type of way, how it's progressing, how it kind of zeroes in on those feelings that you get very much pinpointed throughout the entire course of the movie here. I think they do a very good thing where there are inspired moments in the film in terms of the visuals. There are certain things that are very creepy in terms of visual presentation. There are things that are very intriguing as well, as like it does set a mood in a certain way to draw you into the story and get you a little bit on edge with certain things. It does have a certain sense of getting that, even if it isn't the highest end type of stuff that could be really kind of stylized in a certain way. It does keep a certain grounded sense about how it's presenting things. It doesn't get too overboard. So it's a nice type of way to present the film as a, maybe not the most extravagant budget you could possibly have for it. That'll certainly get into things a little later on with the visual effects in the film, but kind of an interesting little thing in terms of the music in the film, because originally, if you look at the original teaser poster for the film, Christopher Young, who did the scores for the first two Hellraiser films, was originally tasked to do this film. But because apparently the post-production on the film got a little bit stretched out and the schedule got a little bit shifted around, they had to have him bow out as he was no longer available. I get Simon Boswell in this whole thing, who does not disappoint. He still delivers something that does feel very much in line with sort of the Hellraiser sound in a certain way. He gets a very operatic sense about this whole film that doesn't feel like a regular sort of either terribly noir score or terribly horror score. It has those big themes going on the whole thing that feels very much Clive Barker. Clive Barker likes to have that sort of operatic big sense about what's going on. There's a very large scale in a certain way to how the sound of the film is kind of weaving its way around the characters and the situations and the macabre noir type of stuff going on the whole thing. It creates a very big verbose type of score that I think is very haunting. All the different things where you get the sort of chorus coming into the whole thing creates an atmosphere for it. Just recreates an underlying deeper evil that's kind of seeping its way back into the world. The entire thing with Nyx getting back and kind of laying that aura, that ominous feeling throughout the entire film. It starts building up as the film goes on. You get closer to that climax. It starts getting bigger and bigger, stuff like that. Like the fact that you get that sense in this whole thing that doesn't feel like a wallpaper type of horror score. Barker is very specific about what he wants his films to sound like, and this score definitely delivers on that promise of what just Clive Barker wants to paint with that big, broad, strong brush in a certain way to get that sonic experience delved into the atmosphere of this entire film here. But certainly getting into the cast of characters here and the actors portraying these roles, you gotta start with Scott Bakula here, who definitely does a lot of interesting things with the character here that are definitely different from the Last Illusion story, where Harry's portrayed a little bit more kind of cynical, a little bit more sort of attitudinal in a certain way, a little bit more stereotypical sort of New York private eye type of stuff. So kind of progress him a little bit here in some places where obviously Barker had developed him over a number of other stories over the course of time. So he has a little bit of a different perspective than how he was written in the original storyline to make him much more of a different sort of character in this way, where you kind of see an interesting type of progression in the film, where you got the opening sequence there we're getting introduced to all these characters who don't quite seem like they're kind of the classic protagonists you can have. SWANN is kind of the closest thing you maybe get to it, as Barker kind of comments in his own commentary. SWANN's kind of the guy you could kind of, in that opening sequence, kind of say, okay, this seems like the most important character here, but he's way too kind of edgy and kind of vulnerable and stuff like that. He's not the guy you can really latch onto. It feels like he can bear the weight of a story. But once you get into Harry, Bakula just has that classic hero style in the whole thing. His sensibility, how he looks, how he carries himself, just like, yeah, even though this guy definitely has some things he's weighing on him, he's got this entire haywire exorcism that happened in Brooklyn, and he feels a little bit down and out, kind of burned out in certain ways. Like, okay, we still kind of feel like this feels like the most confident guy we can follow up to this point, and definitely see all the things that he's a man of action. He can handle himself in a fight. He has a physical capability to feel like he can be proactive in the story here, and Bakula definitely has those qualities. He's an immensely talented individual. He showed so much of that on Quantum Leap that he could do such a wide range of different things. And it's kind of interesting in the whole thing where I think maybe the Harry D'Amour character could have used a little bit more of a kind of an edge to him in a certain way. I think there's kind of a missing type of thing where you get all those great flashbacks back to the exorcism, stuff like that. It feels like that's something that's supposed to be weighing on the character through the entire story. There's something haunting him. But we don't really get a haunted sense about him in the portrayal that Bakula puts on screen. He feels a little bit too kind of easygoing in a certain way. He's a little bit too without baggage in a certain way. That it feels like he could have a little bit more things weighing upon him throughout the entire course of the story that have a little bit of a sense of progression with the character in a certain way, because you definitely get all this stuff reflected back at the end of the film when Nix gets in D'Amour's head and starts showing him the flashes and stuff like that. The whole thing of touch the darkness, D'Amour, it's been waiting for you, stuff like that. It would be nice to kind of have a little bit of an arc there in a certain way. Have that little bit thread through the entire film instead of just being like, it's a couple flashes here and there and doesn't kind of linger in the story in a certain way. Would have been nice to have a little bit of some sort of weight down upon the character, kind of have him struggle with something internally as the entire film goes on. But Bakula's still a solid leading man. He's a very good leading man. He can just bring the story together and move the entire thing forward, and you just get this very convincing sense that he is a private detective. You feel that very convincingly from his performance. All this stuff moves forward in such a great way. And it's also kind of further important in a certain way to kind of have a little something more under the surface for D'Amour, because in kind of a classic noir fashion, Harry D'Amour is not really the character who's the main focus of a story. He's kind of the guy who gets pulled into other people's stories. So he's kind of that outside tangential element that kind of pushes the narrative forward and kind of has to break the mystery and kind of deconstruct what's going on. So he's kind of a conduit for the audience to step into these more fantastical stories and have that sort of thing going on. So it's not really his story being told, which makes kind of more important that if he had a little bit more something going on himself under the surface of things, to kind of get a little more texture into the character overall, would have made it a little bit more interesting overall and have a little bit more pertinence to himself going through the narrative of Lord of Illusions. But moving on to Kevin J. O'Connor as Philip Swann, it's kind of another sort of change in the character from the original story, where again he was from Hamburg, Germany. He was a little bit more kind of confident, suave type of character. But as you change the entire setup of the story for Lord of Illusions, where in the original story of Last Illusion, it was sort of a thing where Swann sold his soul to certain demonic elements and to get the entire power of magic for himself and become rich and famous, all that type of stuff. And then once he dies, all these demonic elements kind of come out of the woodwork to claim his soul and all that type of stuff. So once you change all that backstory and all these different things, you change the characterization of Swann here. I think Kevin J. O'Connor does play the role properly in this whole thing based on what you have to do with the character here, because of course he's terrified of Nix. He's rattled to the bone. You can see that it informs the entire progression of the character here, who wants none of this stuff. He wants absolutely none of the lingering threat of Nix coming back. He wants to crawl into the darkest, smallest hole he can possibly find in the world to avoid ever having to deal with this guy ever again. So Kevin J. O'Connor does portray Swann in a very good, convincing type of fashion. He sells the threat of Nix very well in this whole thing. Just the terrifying, rattled quality of the character. You just see everything from the frazzled nature of him when he's sitting there in his own mansion. He's not contented with anything. He's just freaked out to living hell. He knows this threat is coming back, and because Nix showed him something right before they took him out, that's what more deeply just terrifies him even further than he was before then. All this stuff's just been lingering in his head for 13 years and just didn't want to ever have to face this. So I love how he does it, and just completely perfect for just what you need to do with the character. I love all that type of stuff. And Famke Janssen, who just absolutely was kind of discovered in this film by Clive Barker, which, because this is also a United Artists production, got her the role in GoldenEye because of it, because he looked at all these photos of all these women, all these actresses, and said, this is Dorothea. Just saw the photo of her, the headshot. That was absolutely it. And just like wherever it was, United Artists took a looking tour and just said, fly out for the screen test for GoldenEye. And she got that, and she made a whole career stemmed out from that role. But it's kind of an interesting thing here with the character of Dorothea, who Famke Janssen does a nice performance for. She is kind of a one-note character. There's not a lot of substance to the character, which is kind of unfortunate with Clive Barker, because he can write some very interesting women. Just not a lot of stuff going on with Dorothea in this whole thing. She just feels like kind of almost a generic character in a certain way. Just like she has to be this character in the whole film that does have an important cog in it, but there's not a lot of layers to the character. There's not a lot to get into in terms of anything else. She just almost stock on a certain way. She just has to be there as the wife of the guy who Nix is after, and gets fallen in love with the private detective, stuff like that. So she just kind of moves through the story with certain cogs, but doesn't have a whole lot of things to say for herself, unfortunately, because Famke Janssen is a magnificent actress. She's done fantastic work over her career. Just didn't have a lot of stuff to work with in this whole thing, but thankfully that opportunity of Lord of Illusions moved into a career-making type of move with GoldenEye there, so a fantastic thing to give to the credit here. And I just love Joel Swetow. This guy is a wonderful actor. I love him in everything I see him in, and just like Valentin's a great character. I just love all the little things that he's got this great chemistry with Scott Bakula. All these scenes they have together, just like they spark off so very well, because Valentin's got this sort of air of arrogance, a little bit of a sardonic type of thing. He's got a little bit of a wit to him in certain places. So he plays things very nicely, and kind of this real nice line of both being kind of shady in a certain way and also being the guy with the best of intentions to be this gatekeeper of all the secrets of SWANN. Give him the secrets of SWANN faking his death and the location of where Nix's body is buried and all these different things. And so he's this gatekeeper of secrets. And I like so much that cog in the story that is this roadblock for D'Amour to get to the truth of everything. He's always trying to veer him off the track and trying to push him away and stuff like that. Cut him off from Dorothea and all these different things. He's a very good character. He's got a lot of little nuances to play this kind of duplicity between the two of them and all these different things. I like so much what he does with this character. It's very interesting. I love everything he does, the charisma he has on screen, all these little things. I just love it. He's one of my favorite characters in the entire film. As you get along in the film, he's got to get cut up by Butterfield and all these harrowing type of things. He plays every beat in the film magnificently. I love it so much. Talking about Butterfield himself, Barry Dell Sherman is a great goddamn actor. He soaked himself so much into this role. I love the slinking serpent quality of Butterfield here. He is the best character in this film for me. I just absolutely love the entire presence of the character, everything he does with the body language. He just moves through the scenes to just get this, even though he's got this sort of ambiguous, androgynous type of feel to him and whatnot, he feels lethal. He feels really dangerous. I love the gimmick with the knives, all that type of stuff. He's always cutting up Quaid early on, and then again, everything else with freaking Valentin on the maid they have there, the SWANN residence. I love the knives. They're such a great little beat to add into the character here. I love everything he does in the entire thing. I love the fact that he's kind of jealous of SWANN because Butterfield wants to be that apprentice. He wants that admiration. He wants that validation from Nick so much. And when he goes through all this effort to find him and resurrect him and all these different things he constructed to be able to bring him back from death, just smacks him around as like Swann's the only one who's worthy. All these different things. I like so much of what that character does. Barry Del Sherman's excellent in this goddamn role. It feels, again, very Clive Barker in a certain way. You have that kind of sexuality of the character very upfront in the whole thing, but the undercurrent of the character is so deadly in a certain way. You do have a threat with him, especially with his henchman of Miller there, who's got all this garish type of stuff going on with the things or whatever the hell is going on. Just this wonderful pairing, just like it just is a wonderful type of way to have Harry introduced into the kind of oddness of the story in LA after he came in from New York. Just these two weird type of guys. It's like there's something not right going on around here. And Daniel von Bargen, rest his soul now, he passed away a couple of years ago after a long battle with some illnesses, including diabetes. He'd passed away through all that stuff, but this guy was an amazing actor. He did so many great things between some hilarious comedy stuff and just absolutely great drama. And this is such an interesting character for him to have delved into this entire thing, where he kind of read the script originally and kind of like was kind of taken aback by the whole thing. But once he sat down and talked with Clive, he started getting into the nuance and the texture and all these little things about the entire project, and he just got clicked into it so easily. And just like, I love Nix. Clive was so very intent on the presentation of Nix here. This guy looks all disheveled, like you pulled him out of the gutter somewhere. It just doesn't look remarkable in any type of way, but the ominous dread that you get from this character is so potent. The power that he wields is terrifying. Just the ominous sense you get overall from the presentation, right from the beginning of the film. It lingers throughout the entire damn movie, just like this sense of Nix coming back. This guy who was terrifying at the beginning, and is even more horrifying by the end of the film, is unmatched in a certain way. Just like how they introduce him and keep that fear going for the next like hour and 40 minutes or so is very, very much on the head of Daniel von Bargen to get that performance buried into the consciousness of the entire audience. It's just terrifying, just absolutely wonderful type of stuff. Just like how he has this magnetism about himself to pull these people into his sway and all these different things to build this cult around him. You can definitely see these little things he has going on. He's just penetrating in so many different things, just like how he just zeroes in when he comes back and he kind of takes a moment to recognize Dorothea and is like, oh shit. All these different things just builds very well. I just love all these different things and how just they have this synergy between Swann and Nix there, that it is ultimately their story. Even though Nix is not present for most of the film and Swann is not really that kind of out front type of protagonist. It ultimately comes down to these two guys. They started the film and they bookend the film. A nice type of way how all these kind of elements kind of move back around and interlock by the end of the film between these two characters. The interactions are so absolutely fantastic between the two characters. It's like the dialogue is so rich and so dark in such a way where just like Nix was this guy who says himself, a guy who wanted to be God and then changed his mind. There was something that happened to him over the course of being wherever he was for 13 years, wanted to make him come back and just obliterate everything. I was born to murder the world is such a horrifying line, and he delivers it so chillingly and just makes for a fantastic villain. Just like the fact that he doesn't have to be present throughout the entire film to have an impact on it is such an incredible type of thing. I just love so much of the cast here. They do such a great job, and Barker can really write characters, and the dialogue is so damn good in so many places. I really like what he does when he can get really theatrical with a lot of these different things. It has a power to it and just really penetrates so much in the entire damn film. And talking about the effects work done for Lord of Illusions, it's kind of a very interesting type of thing because the makeup effects are actually fantastic in the whole film, but the visual effects are very much a mixed bag, and I'm definitely going to get to that. But for a lot of the effects work, they brought in K&B Effects Group to do a whole bunch of stuff, especially the burn makeup on Butterfield at the end of the film where he just gets all blistered out and stuff like that, and they got these little steel wool kind of filaments put into the whole thing, so it kind of has this kind of glowing electricity effect when he's kind of like busting out and all these different things. It looks absolutely gross in a certain way, but it's just fantastic work. I think they probably also did the stuff on Miller with all the sharpened teeth and the kind of little things they do with his complexion, stuff like that. And a few other different things, especially the stuff with Quaid is kind of interesting with all the knives put into him, all that type of stuff. But it's actually Steve Johnson XFX that did all the work on Nix at the end of the film, where he comes back from the grave and have all these sort of rotted out indentations for all the kind of like cast iron stuff that was binded to him into death and all that type of stuff. So it's kind of a very interesting design to see how that stuff kind of changes his look and all these different things. And it's just like, they did a fantastic job of that type of stuff. Just like the mega effects are on such a remarkably solid, exceptional level from different effects teams that had equal amount of talent involved. Steve Johnson had worked with a lot of different people, a lot of great films throughout the 80s and 90s. Wonderful type of stuff there. But the physical effects throughout the entire film are just remarkably well done, especially you got the whole thing with the demon, with the flashback to the exorcism. All that stuff is wonderfully shot, wonderfully executed and presented. All the stuff comes together with all the gore effects all over the place. Everyone did such a great job with that stuff. But again, the visual effects really kind of have a very inconsistent quality to them, because they spread them across a lot of different effects houses at this point in time. They probably had a few optical composites, but a lot of digital effects. And $11 million in 1995 does not get you a lot of traction, a lot of headway into the digital effects field to get a really good quality of things. And so a lot of them don't come off terribly well. There's a whole thing in the middle of the film where they got the entire kind of what they think is Nix coming back and kind of coming after Swann's body and stuff like that in the SWANN residence. Clive Barker was kind of intentional on not making it look too realistic, but there's certain aspects of that sequence where, like, the fire explodes behind Damore and just looks really awful in HD. I never noticed how that it had a real degradation in quality until I watched the Blu-ray version of it. It definitely does not hold up whatsoever. And the kind of origami man, it's a very, very interesting idea. Does show its age because it's not a high quality visual digital effect. And certainly when they composite into some of the live action footage, there's a vast degradation in the quality of the whole thing. The vast degradation in resolution. It just looks really soft and washed out. It doesn't look very good. And a couple of little things are kind of okay here and there, but you can definitely see that they're just very ambitious for the lack of budget it really has to achieve what it wants to. I definitely entirely applaud Clive Barker's ambition with his imagination, all these different things, what he wants to do. A lot of it just doesn't quite hold up over time for what you really want to. Even at the end of the film, you got that very interesting effect where Swann finally gets dispatched completely by Nix by having his skin peeled off and the tissue peeled off, so it's just a dead skeleton there. But it's a wonderful idea. It's kind of an interesting design of things, but again, it definitely shows its age in these visual effects. They don't hold up terribly well over time, and probably at the time probably didn't look quite as convincing as they possibly could. You know, again, it's just the fact of not having enough budget when you got stuff like Jurassic Park and Terminator 2 and a lot of other big CGI films that had close to $100 million to work with. This one doesn't have the amount of money to kind of really dig into, have that great of effects work put into the entire makeup of the film, but the imagination on display is very powerful, and I really much like what they envisioned for what they wanted to do with the film. They just didn't quite have as much tools evolved to the point where they could really do that for the amount of money they had to spend on the film. And it is so much that Clive Barker had that ambition, that imagination, all these different things that he wanted to do, just inject different things into horror, even though a lot of the films that were based off of his material weren't really the major blockbuster successes that you could look at, like Friday the 13th or Nightmare on Elm Street or later on the Scream franchise. They didn't hit huge numbers, but what I can give to a lot of the Clive Barker stuff is that he didn't do the normal stuff. Nothing that was ever predictable, nothing that was ever expected. He always tried to introduce new ideas and try to push the genre of horror in different directions, especially in the film realm here. His ideas, his stuff that be adapted in the films was new, it was different, it wasn't the same old stuff. He tried to introduce things that would kind of challenge the audience a little bit, have a different type of story, some kind of blending of new elements, just try to create a new breed of horror in such a way that I think Lord of Illusions definitely has that stamp on it, because in the 90s, horror was kind of, didn't really have much of a direction. It was after the 80s kind of burned out from all the slasher stuff, the franchise fatigue. the 90s kind of floated around in different directions, didn't really kind of form up in anything that was terribly successful until much later on in the decade. It was such a thing that Clive Barker could come in and try to do something new with it, try to revitalize it, or just try to inject something that was kind of different in such a way that it is a much more mature type of thing. It's not the kind of kitschy type of horror stuff you'd had maybe in the last decade or whatnot, but he had new, interesting, fascinating ideas to get into this whole thing. I think Lord of Illusions, in general, has some very good elements to it that I like. All the stuff, the magic in this whole thing. I love the entire division between illusionist and magician type of stuff, where even though Swann is an actual magician, he doesn't want to let anyone know that. He doesn't want anyone to know the power that he has, because that'll lead them down darker roads and stuff in the Nyx and trying to figure out how to get that power for themselves. He's terrified of what he has because he's seen what Nyx could do with that type of stuff, so letting anyone else know about this stuff is very, very dangerous. So he wants to maintain the illusion that he is an illusionist, that he's just kind of trickery and smoke and mirrors type of stuff. It's such an interesting thing for that character to make that, when again, he's kind of this petrified character in such a way that he's not doing this so much for all the fame or adulation and stuff like that. He's very much a guy just terrified in such a way, knowing that this knowledge is kind of dangerous and kind of very terrifying to have in a certain way. I just like the entire thing where you got D'Amour going to the Magic Castle, which is such a stamp on this film in such a way, because it's such a sort of closed off community in such a way. They're not just going to let anyone into that whole place as just a filmmaker kind of going in there and tinkering around with their secrets or anything like that. So they definitely had a lot of trust to having Clive Barker to kind of step into their place and use it for the film and stuff like that, and have it as a backdrop in a certain way for this community and this kind of secretive type of thing they have going on with guys like Vinovich, portrayed by the excellent Vincent Schiavelli, and all these different little things that kind of get a little deeper, darker into the entire nitty-gritty of the whole thing. I really like that they gave Clive Barker that permission to use the Magic Castle and have that part of the entire real-life language of the whole film. These little things kind of add into both the magic and slight noir type of stuff in Los Angeles there. Like, I like that they blend the entire genres there. I like the entire feeling of it, because there's a lot of success to be tapped in that entire thing, getting noir and horror twisted up and together and type of stuff like that. Again, I think Barker does a good job with that. And it's kind of a shame that the director's cut did not get into theaters, because, again, they chopped 12 minutes out of it, which included a lot of character development scenes, a lot of little things, especially some gore stuff here and there, but they kind of cut out a lot of the legs out of the characters, the kind of the motivations, kind of the deeper information in the film that really does fill out the entire goddamn movie. It creates a much fuller film that makes a lot more sense. It kind of just fleshes out the ideas more and gets more of a full film out there that I think could be more appreciated. It obviously has been by fans. They do very much appreciate the director's cut over the theatrical cut and stuff like that. So it's like such an interesting thing that it's such a film that I think isn't the best type of work it possibly could have been. I've been a lot more overly passionate about my love for Lord of Illusions in the past. A little bit more simmered on it over time here. I think it is still a good film. It's very fascinating in so many different ways that, again, you don't get quite this type of story injected into horror films anymore. You don't get this kind of just creative process, because it's sparking off interesting imagination that Clive is so fertile with. It's such a good thing that to see this film and see how you could do that type of stuff kind of would hopefully inspire other people to kind of try that type of genre blending type of stuff again. Go into the whole thing, kind of play around with it, because I think there's more potential to get out of this type of story, especially out of the Harry D'Amour character. Obviously, Barker's done that plenty of times with other stories. He had this entire story he was working on for a long, long time, which brought Harry D'Amour into the Hellraiser franchise in novel form, called The Scarlet Gospels, where he encounters Pinhead, stuff like that. This whole 400-plus page novel they put together over a long period of time here. He's had a lot of history with Harry, and it's kind of interesting to not see that there's been enough sort of traction going forward to get more Harry D'Amour out on screen, because there was talk of a television series at one point in time with the Sci-Fi Channel, but got in development and didn't go anywhere. And again, there's this whole thing where there's one interview where Scott Bakula says there might have been a possibility of a sequel to this at one point in time, but the plug got pulled at the last minute. But I don't know how far that really genuinely got any type of way. But It's a very interesting character. I think there's a lot of fertile ground to just mine for this whole thing. I just think Lord of Illusions on its own, I don't think it's an amazing film. I think it had a lot more potential to get out of it because, again, Clive wasn't the most experienced director possible. It's only the third theatrical feature-length film he had directed with a much more seasoned director with Clive's direct input. I think there could have been a lot more mind of it in a certain way, but it's a very pure transition of his ideas and his vision from what he got in that little short story almost 8 years prior and moving forward into this whole thing to get a very faithful transition, what he wanted to see on screen. Not a lot of people are as big of a fans for it, stuff like that, but I think there's a lot of things to admire for the vision that Barker was going for. So guys, definitely get your thoughts and comments below. I really think there's a lot of stuff to talk about in this whole film if you have a little bit of thing, because I know some people are really not into it, and some people think Scott Bakula was a great Harry D'Amour. Some people think he's a little bit of a flawed casting choice and the whole thing. There's a little bit of a range, a little bit of a spectrum of opinion of that whole thing. I hopefully kind of pinpoint some things that are very important to kind of take into consideration regarding that, but really like to hear you guys talk about that type of stuff. There's a whole bunch of different things with Clive Barker's stuff. Even though he didn't direct anything after this, he still allowed other people to take his material and adapt it into feature films, where he covers stuff like Midnight Meat Train on this whole thing several years back. So there's a lot of different things that still maintain having Clive Barker stuff go up on the big screen after this. So guys, thanks so much. Stay well. Take care. Bye-bye.